We're heading down to the Vermont-Massachusetts border in a little town called Pommel. There's a gentleman down there that had a roadside encounter several years ago. We got the call through the BFRO. Dave and I met him.
How does that work with you guys? Like, how do people file a report? Like, if they get in touch with you, are you getting that from the BFRO?
Well, we have two avenues. We get people contact us through the BFRO. Dave and I handle Massachusetts with a couple other people, and then this part of Vermont has no one really covering it. So Steve Kulls from New York keeps an eye on it. I keep an eye on it. And then Dr. David Brake is another investigator. He's up in northern Vermont. He keeps an eye on things in the Bennington County, Windsor County area down here. We came up through Woodford and Searsburg, and very low populated. You talk with people up here and they keep to themselves, and not a lot of outsiders. And what you don't have up here, you don't have a lot of tourism. You don't have a lot of people up here. You know, the Appalachian Trail, we actually crossed the Appalachian Trail when we came up Route 9, and that goes right through my hometown of Adams. So you'll get those people coming through, but there's just not a lot of people up here in the woods in the summertime. There's a tremendous amount of snowmobiling up here in the winter. But I just think the demographics are a little bit different here in Vermont because everything's so spread out up here.
I think the same thing. It's a lot of these towns, very low population. A lot of these places been in generations where a lot of people just say, leave them alone, and we don't want people coming in and invest. They don't want groups coming up there, and especially in the last 5-10 years, I think it's really exploded.
Right.
Mainstream.
Yeah.
So a lot of people don't want the attention. They don't want to be, accused of hoaxing all that.
We're on Route 7 here, which is the main route coming through the area. In the southern Vermont, just in the beginning of the Green Mountains, a gentleman was driving a commercial transport bus in the middle of the night between 2 and 3 o'clock, and he witnessed a very tall creature come out of the wood line right here on the east side of the street, cross over to the west side of the street, and then go right up here into the woods. And it was about 2:30 in the morning, and there is no street lighting up here, as you can see. But down there, I'm sure it was pretty dark at the time, so he would have only had the headlights. But he did describe it as a typical Sasquatch. About 5 miles south of here is where an elderly couple were coming up. They were heading up to the Green Mountains in their RV, and they looked out into a field and saw one running at a high rate of speed through the field, paralleling them. And then a school teacher at sunset with her dog up at the base of Mount Greylock, which is where the Appalachian Trail comes through. She was maybe a couple miles south of that, so about 7-8 miles from here. She saw one come out of the tree line, and it looked at her, and they both gasped. She gasped, and the creature gasped, and the dog just froze. The dog wouldn't even move, and then it just took off. And by the time we got up there, we found some impressions and stuff, but a couple months had passed, and there really wasn't much evidence of it. But she's an educated school teacher who's retired now. She moved up to Maine, but I found her story just as compelling as these other two. So that's 3 sightings within a 2-year time frame, all within 5 to 7 miles of each other. The other spot of interest was at the top of this hill, where we found 2 acres of stick structures. Because when we're driving on these back roads, Dave yells at me all the time because I'm wandering, because I'm always looking in the woods and stuff. Say, hey, eyes on the road. We found this area with these stick structures that are commonly found when there's Sasquatch activity. And what we found interesting about them was every tree had one on it, which is interesting because last week we were in Savoy State Forest, where we found a same area like that. Do you want to go take a look and see if those stick structures are still there?
How do we get up?
You just drive up the road. Yeah, I can see a whole bunch of interesting things in here, but there's also a lot of storm damage in here. It's been about 5 years since we've been up here, but this whole area up here, yeah, see, it's really hard to tell. But this area up here, was just loaded. Every tree up here had these stick structures on them. I wish we could find one that you could see. But what was, Dave and I both noticed, there were little ones too. So where the big ones were up against the tree, right next to them there was a little tiny small one. Well, what made the little small one?
Yeah.
Maybe a juvenile? And that's when we found the area that was like cordoned off, almost like it was like a little corral. And that was just beyond the line of sight here. So maybe 200 feet in is where we found that. And there was a couple of branches in between trees that it was being rubbed on, almost looked like something was playing on it or something. You know, it's all speculation and conjecture and stuff. And look at anything here. That's all I need to get poison ivy. Oh, there's poison sumac right there. So there's a few speculative things out here, but this is loaded. There's sumac in here, there's poison ivy. Yeah, I am not going in there. But there's an interesting one in there that doesn't look like it's natural. Straight ahead, it looks like a big X. Looks like, and how, you know, you could sit here and be like, oh, you know, they fell like that. Sure, absolutely. Why don't you come on, take a quick walk in here. You have all these different species, and they're stacked up like little teepees. These are older, but then you look over there, there's another one. You look over there, there's another one. You look over there, there's another one. There. These are older because you can tell the breaks aren't that fresh. But that one there, I like that one a lot. But while we were here, we did hear a couple of wood knocks that day.
When was that? How far?
I'd have to look up the report. I would say 19, maybe 2018 or 19, so it's 5 or 6 years ago. But I see remnants of where we were looking, and this was the spot.
In 1909, James P. Taylor had a vision of a hiking trail that would stretch along the Green Mountains all the way from the border of Massachusetts up to Canada. In 1910, the long trail began construction, and its final stretch was completed in 1930, thanks to the hard work of the Green Mountain Club, which is still one of the stewards of the trail system today. The popularity of the 272-mile long trail became the inspiration for the Appalachian Trail, and ultimately the trails would share a 100-mile stretch along the ridges of the Green Mountains. There's a history of Bigfoot sightings within the area, even preceding the construction of the long trail. On October 17, 1879, in Pownal, a town known widely as the Gateway to Vermont, 2 young hunters were startled by a 5-foot-tall creature said to resemble a man in form and movement, but entirely covered by bright red hair. With a long, straggling beard and wild eyes, the hunters first mistook it for a bear and shot at it, wounding it. Upon being hit, the creature turned on its assailants, charged at them, and caused them such fear that they dropped their weapons while in flight. Local papers recorded that the young men were too frightened to return to the area and retrieve their weapons and ammunition. This encounter revitalized a much older story of a strange animal frequently seen along the range of the Green Mountains, a wild man of the mountains.
Well, the neat thing about Vermont is that other than maybe Bernie Sanders or skiing, you really hear nothing about it. And that is because it is relatively small, but much of Vermont is national forest, the Green Mountain National Forest, hence the name, the Green Mountain State, or maybe the Green Mountain Forest came from that name, but it's a small state, very, very sparsely populated. I think the largest community is Burlington, which is somewhere around 50,000 people. Don't quote me on that. So you get a sense compared to other states where, you know, a 50,000 or even 100,000 person town or municipality is tiny compared to everywhere else. So Vermont is very, very unique. And I'll just say personally, one of the reasons I love it is because it's really off the radar. You don't hear too much about it. But again, a lot of it is just undeveloped, rural, if it is developed, agricultural, perhaps if it's developed at all, or just wild. A national forest, protected state lands, whatever, but all part of this northeastern New England, you know, woodlands, temperate rainforest I've heard described used. You know, you've got mountains, you've got river valleys, this incredible diversity of habitats. Goes back to this edge effect all through here, the rich diversity of wildlife. I didn't mention this earlier, but in some areas, golden eagles actually, you know, we think of that as this wild western creature, okay? They used to nest in the Adirondacks and other parts of New England, at least up until the 50s, 60s, and possibly even the 70s or 80s in some areas. And in some parts, perhaps in Maine, there are some discussions that they may be returning, if not literally today, but in the near future. And so, again, some very, very wild habitats. And if we extend that up into northeastern Canada, it's even more remote and more wild and more undeveloped and much more expansive. And so again, all of these areas are not, you can't think of them as isolated spots, right? They're all interconnected. And if this creature exists, presumably it's got wide ranging and dispersal ability, maybe a very dispersed population structure, few and far between, so to speak, but all sort of connected. So it's quite likely that these animals, these creatures, are roaming vast areas as part of their normal home range or territory. And it could include all of these different areas we've talked about, from Western Mass on up into New York, over into Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, up into northeastern Canada. I mean, the sky's the limit in terms of the habitat and the resources that are there. And yes, winters can be hard, as can be summers, as we're seeing today with 100-degree temperatures. But, you know, animals have adapted to survive, right? Moose survive the winter and the summer. Bears go into hibernation. You know, all these animals have survival strategies to survive. And so, again, for me, it's certainly within the realm of feasibility that this undocumented animal could survive here, yeah, and possibly thrive.
Sightings have continued from 1879 forward and become more frequent with the advent of the Long Trail. In 2016, the Vermont Trails and Greenways Council estimated that nearly 200,000 people use the Long Trail each year, creating plenty of opportunities for potential sightings to occur. It's often said that for a Sasquatch to be seen, two things are always needed: a Bigfoot and a human witness.
I know a lot of people would argue over whether the Long Trail was here before the Appalachian Trail. I'm not much of a hiker on the Appalachian Trail. That's some hardcore hike in there. I think they equally have quite a bit of history between them. So that's where the people are, so that's where the sightings are going to happen. You can't have a sighting without a person there. And there could be Sasquatch in all of these mountain ranges up here, but if there's nobody there to see it, then do we really know that they're there? That's this whole chicken egg thing that goes on between in the Bigfoot community as well. How do we know that there aren't Sasquatches in other places? Because nobody's there to see them. So I think they both equally have their part in the Bigfoot community. I've heard reports from both trails. The Appalachian Mountain Trail goes right over the top of Mount Greylock, which you can see the peak from here. It's the highest point in Massachusetts, which isn't really that high. It's only 3,200 feet, but for Massachusetts, that's a pretty big mountain. I have done 7 different sightings on the Appalachian corridor from one end of the state to the other. Massachusetts isn't that big of wide of a state.
So when it comes to Vermont, as opposed to some of the other New England states, is actually primarily mostly mountainous, even more so than, say, New Hampshire. Neighboring New Hampshire, which, yes, it has the most rugged and tallest mountains in the entire Northeast, but the whole southern part of New Hampshire isn't as mountainous, whereas Vermont, basically from southern Vermont all the way to northern Vermont, the Canadian border, has mountains going the whole way. And you have the Appalachian Trail going through most of it, and the Long Trail going from north to south. I mean, you have Jay Peak, which is very close to the Canadian border, and then you have the Bennington Triangle and Glastonbury Mountain, which is very close to Massachusetts. And all throughout there, you have the Breadloaf Wilderness, you've got Stowe Mountain, Camel's Hump. You have so many mountains just in between in all different sides of Vermont. That's what I really like about Vermont. Driving through parts of Vermont, it almost reminds you of West Virginia, which is the mountain state. There's so many mountain valleys and little farms. I'm from New Hampshire, and you can kind of visibly tell the differences between New Hampshire and Vermont, even though they're very similar states. But when it comes to Sasquatch, there are encounters, of course, given that there's so many mountains and really great wilderness. The Green Mountain Wilderness has different sections throughout Vermont, and there's been reports all around it from basically the southern end all the way to the northern end.
So looking at some of those mapping projects, there are sightings up and around the trail, and especially going into the Appalachian Trail. Again, you got a pathway, people are moving. Again, if you got people moving, you got to have sightings. If you don't have people, you're not going to have a sighting. But yes, looking at that map on the trail, there's definitely some stuff.
So the Long Trail is the longest oldest continuous trail in the U.S. It was first started around 1910 and finished around 1930. It's roughly 275 miles long. Roughly 100 miles of that equates with the Appalachian Trail, the AT. But certainly it runs up what we call the spine, the Green Mountain spine of Vermont, and definitely for sure a lot of the reports starting in the late 1750s actually up to the current time are associated with the spine of the Green Mountain.
There are so many connections between the Green Mountain National Forest, the Appalachian Trail, the Kinderhook area, the Whitehall area, the Warren, it's just, everything is so connected. And it's very interesting that when you start having sightings in some of these areas, they seem to be very concentrated for a while. And you'll have a sighting that'll occur that hasn't been publicized. One of the most interesting things that happened in Vermont was there was a sighting and nobody knew about it. I knew about it. And 9 months later, a gentleman comes up with a trail cam photo, allegedly, and it was less than a 1/10 of a mile from where that sighting was. And then a year later, 5 miles away, there was another sighting by 2 children. A sighting a year after that, within 3 miles of that, of 2 boaters, seeing one on the shoreline as they're boating on one of the resort lakes. So that whole area consistently has had sightings, and it's all so interconnected because, like I said, Bear Road goes right into Vermont. So it's not a big shocker that you have all these things in congruity.
Bigfoot reports are scattered across the entirety of the state. With so much of Vermont being prime habitat for large mammals to live and thrive, there really isn't a place that would be considered inhospitable to a creature like Sasquatch. From encounters near apple orchards on the western side of the state to sightings on the mountains on the eastern side, reports pervade the region. A case from 2005 provides a quintessential example. A family vacationing in central Vermont near Ludlow were hoping to spot some moose on a lonely road. Instead, as they drove along, both father and daughter saw something else entirely crossing the road, 50 feet in front of their car. It was 8 feet tall, with a conical head and pronounced arm swing enhanced by massive hands. Covering the road in 2 easy strides, the creature turned its head to look at the car as it passed.
The most compelling one was a school teacher right along the Appalachian Trail where her and her dog were stargazing, and one walked right out in front of her, at least 100, maybe less than 100 feet in front of her, stood there, and they both gasped at each other. She gasped The creature gasped, the dog just froze, and then it just walked away at a brisk pace. And she found us on the internet and to tell her story. That's one of my most favorite stories from the Appalachian Trail. She was only maybe a quarter mile from the trailhead when that happened. We're sitting in it right now. This southern part of Vermont at the New York-Massachusetts border has the largest cluster that I can find, just short of up by Rutland into the Whitehall area. So I would say between those two, it's pretty close to being the same.
Yeah, so in the history of Leamington, it's a book, and it's connected with Essex County, Vermont, which is in the northeast portion, and it relates to a hunter's story where he encountered a creature that he initially thought it was a bear, and then it rose up, and he realized it was not a bear, and he fired off a couple of shots off it, and it ran out into the woods. And then when the story got back to the townspeople, it turns out that there were a lot of other townspeople that had reported really strange occurrences, including their gardens being torn up and being just basically destroyed, and hearing weird vocalizations and the like during the night, and some people reporting seeing a creature running off with their vegetables out of their garden.
I don't know if they were as compelling as looking at the geography around those. The swamps, the pathways, the stream beds, those core wildlife corridors that would make it a good area to look for something.
I find many different, there's so many to choose from going back so long. Like I said, the first reports actually come from the Native Americans back to a nickname for the creature called slippery skin or old slippery skin. There's also been reports, the Bennington monster. There's been just reports through the 1800s into the 1900s, into the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s. I guess for me, one of the most compelling reports was when I recently interviewed a gentleman. Abenaki descent is the tribe. They have their own native name for the creature, and I interviewed him, and he has had multiple sightings since he was a child. When he was a child, he was out playing, and he came back and reported it to his grandmother, who was a full-blooded Abenaki, and then she said, "You stay away from those creatures. They're not good people. You have to just stay away from them." And then since then, he's probably had 5 or 6 different encounters, many of them associated with the Long Trail in Vermont. Yeah.
The most compelling one I've ever heard was I don't know if we want to use the name, but it was the Grabowski farm incident. I mean, it's very well known. And the family has a large farm between Castleton, Vermont and Rutland. And months, I don't know if it was previous or afterwards, but Dr. Warren Cook, who was one of the leading researchers back in the late 60s, early 70s of this, his daughter had actually had a roadside crossing in the vicinity of the Grabowski farm, but the Grabowskis had actually seen a family of them, a couple of big ones, a couple of small ones, on their property, moving about, and they had several sightings on their properties over the years. Nothing aggressive, nothing crazy, which leads to the credibility of it. Like, they didn't, we just saw it. They wasn't trying to break down their doors or anything silly like that, or taking their livestock. It was just, there they were. But coincidentally, it was the owners of a ski resort on Bird Mountain, when there was a ski resort there, they had seen a family of them moving across the slopes during a spring or summer day, when there's no snow, obviously. So you have this very interesting, congruity that you have over here. You have this family saying, this group of people saying, well, we saw a family of them, and then months later, 5, 6, 7 miles away, there's the same group in that same mountain, that same connector, basically. Another interesting thing about that area, just as I was up on Bird Mountain doing an investigation, and we had actually had a UAP sighting in the daytime. Bright light, middle of the day, hung out there for about 40 minutes. This is all before drones were a thing. This was back in, I want to say, 2011, 2010. So this is before drones were even a thing.
From supposed man-eating rocks inhabiting the peak of Glastonbury Mountain to remnants of ghost towns throughout the region, there's no shortage of folklore in this area of the United States. The Wampahoofus, also known as Old Slippery Skin, is described as a large bear-like animal with unusual intelligence and an elusive nature, making it hard to catch. It's said to be able to evade traps and even backtrack its own tracks to confuse pursuers. The creature also has a vengeful streak and has been blamed for various mischiefs, like flattening cornfields and frightening livestock. Vermont has documented numerous stone chambers, structures built from rock scattered throughout the landscape. These chambers are shrouded in mystery, with their origins and purpose debated, leading to various theories and folklore surrounding them, including the thought that their construction harkens back to the age of the Roman Empire. Of course, there's the Bennington Triangle, known for all manner of odd occurrences, but most famously for a group of disappearances in the late 1940s. And then there's Champ. In their oral traditions, the Abenaki spoke of a giant serpentine creature known as Gittaskog, which was believed to lurk beneath the surface of Lake Champlain. Since then, sightings of a lake monster have given rise to the affectionately named Champ, memorialized in local festivals, souvenirs, and documentaries. The folklore doesn't stop there, though. There's the Pigman of Northfield, the apparent curse of Brunswick Springs resulting in repeated hotel fires, and whispers of catamounts, or mountain lions, which, despite official pronouncements, keep being seen in the wilds of the Green Mountain State.
I haven't heard a lot of folklore from the Green Mountains, but there's plenty of folklore in Massachusetts about the Sasquatch.
Back in the earlier days, there was a governor in Vermont who actually put on his campaign slogan, "We're going to bring in Old Slippery Skin." This was a legendary creature in the Vermont region, and a name of the creature that had been dubbed that. And it was sort of described as a strange bear and so forth. So that was one of the first broken campaign promises you might have in political times. So actually Bigfoot was, this was a time period where you would have reports of these creatures, and there would be entire town hunting parties that would go out looking for them. And in fact, if you go to Pownal, Vermont, that was a report that was made the front page of the New York Times. And that was a report of this 5-foot tall, reddish brown creature that was sighted by hunters. And they were so scared they just threw their weapons and ran out of the woods. So these sightings pop up all through Vermont, and there's a rich history here.
If you look even across the globe, right, where you've got cultures that have grown up in these mountainous areas, and in fact, I mean, anywhere, whether it's, you know, the so-called like swamp people or the mountain people or the river bottom people, whatever, they all have their folklore, and much of that is entwined with nature and natural stories and experiences. And what has fascinated me across my career, and I've had the good fortune literally over the 30 and 40 years that I've been a veterinarian and a biologist, literally working coast to coast in North America and actually down into Central America as well, across almost all of the habitats, and not just the major habitats, but many minor ones as well. Wherever you go, there are stories you will hear if you listen and talk to people of mysteries involving natural things, nature, and oftentimes it's Sasquatch type creatures. And I remember the first time I heard somebody tell me about a credible account of a Sasquatch one of their friends claimed to have seen in Minnesota. And I was dumbfounded because I associated so much with the Northwest. But the coastal swamps of North Carolina, Ohio, where I grew up, you dive into these areas and there are these stories. New England, rich abundance of historical accounts of large giants and hairy creatures that don't fit the description of what we would call a normal human being or any other known animal. So there is this rich history of folklore, and some of that does revolve around these mysterious giant hominid primate type creatures.
So there's some theories about there maybe being a history of folklore with Sasquatch-like creatures in Vermont. A prominent one is the kind of stagecoach. There was some sort of incident in the 1800s on Glastonbury Mountain or thereabouts where some sort of stagecoach was, I don't know if it was attacked or had an encounter with some kind of gorilla ape-like creature. There's a supposedly story that goes back to Samuel de Champlain, who was one of the first explorers in this area. Lake Champlain was named after him. He had supposedly heard from the natives that there were stories of these hairy man-like creatures in the woods that I can't remember if it wasn't Gugwe, but it was some sort of a strange name. Other people have associated stories like Old Slippery Skin with Bigfoot. Now, Old Slippery Skin story I think was sort of a bear. It was a large bear, but some people have lumped it in with the Bigfoot stuff. You know, like many of the other New England states, there's been a long history of not only native habitation of this area, so the indigenous cultures, but also it's one of the areas that's been colonized the longest, right? It was settled by Europeans.
So the Abenaki folklore in particular really stands out. They have a name for the creature, Manoj Masak, which stands for giant shadow. And they have a really quite an interesting connection because they believe that this creature knew the land, was tied to the land, and so they were like together essentially, and trying to understand and linking each of their cultures to each other essentially. And there's, again, it's just been passed down through many different generations, the Abenaki all the way to the present day. This has been studied by anthropologists. There's been a couple books written on it by a University of Vermont anthropologist. There's also been a story of the Leamington Monster, which again is associated with this folklore. There's even been reports, there's actually a couple ghost towns in Vermont, one in particular called Glastonbury, which is in the southwest corner of area of Vermont. It's an old town that was actually an old charcoal town that made a lot of charcoal, and then it just basically dried up. But there have been reports and sightings of unusual occurrences in that area as well.
Vermont is a very heavily forested state with northern hardwoods such as maples and birch, and conifers like spruce and fir being the dominant trees. Approximately 78% of the state is covered by forests, amounting to roughly 4.5 million acres. However, it's important to note that forest fragmentation and conversion to development are concerns, with an estimated 12,470 acres of forest land lost to development each year. The Green Mountains, part of the Appalachian Mountain System, extend for 250 miles from north to south through the center of Vermont, with a maximum width of 36 miles. Many peaks rise above 3,000 feet, with the loftiest being Mount Mansfield, at 4,393 feet. Vermont is home to a variety of mammals, including black bear, moose, beavers, white-tailed deer, bobcats, coyotes, and several species of bats. The state's wetlands, forests, and other habitats support a wide range of bird species, including waterfowl like ducks, mergansers and loons, wading birds such as herons and egrets, and songbirds.
Oh gosh, in Vermont, just a wild, so what we call a swag, a scientific wild-ass guess. I would say somewhere in the vicinity of 70% of the state is forested, maybe 80, and maybe even more than that. But as far as the national forest, I think the Green Mountain National Forest, I think probably it may be 30% of the state. Now you've kind of piqued my curiosity to go look these numbers up, but certainly much of Vermont is forested, whether it's protected national forest or just, you know, privately owned or municipality, whatever. But yeah, I'm willing to bet up to 80% of the state is forested.
Vermont holds a unique place in American history, largely due to its independent spirit. The Abenaki, part of the Algonquian language family, established themselves in what's now Vermont around 10,000 years ago. They lived in wigwams and longhouses, relying on hunting, fishing, and agriculture for sustenance. Their interactions with European settlers would profoundly influence Vermont's cultural development. Before joining the United States, Vermont existed as an independent republic for 14 years, from 1777 to 1791. It declared independence from Great Britain and the jurisdictions of New Hampshire and New York, establishing its own government, currency, and postal service. Not coincidentally, Vermont was the first state in North America to abolish slavery in its constitution in 1777, reflecting a commitment to human rights that predates the national movement for abolition. In the years that followed, many residents actively participated in the Underground Railroad, helping enslaved people escape to freedom in Canada. And ultimately, a high percentage of Vermonters lost their lives in the Civil War, fighting for freedom. During the American Revolution, Vermont's Green Mountain Boys, a militia group led by Ethan Allen, played a significant role in key battles like the capture of Fort Ticonderoga in 1775 and the Battle of Bennington in 1777, which is still considered a turning point in the war and is celebrated as a legal holiday in the state. Though centuries have passed since its inception, Vermont has managed to maintain much of its rural character. The state's rugged terrain and strong agricultural traditions ensure that small farms and close-knit communities are still a defining feature of Vermont life.
Well, Vermont is part of that whole Northeast. Whitehall was the birthplace of the U.S. Navy. You're only 30 miles from Vermont, and so Whitehall is all part of that revolutionary time, and the Green Mountain Boys and so forth. So there's a rich history here.
So Vermont is very unique in terms of American history. I believe it was actually independent at one point. It's kind of its own country. You have the history of the Green Mountain Boys. They were very notable back in the day. Vermont has always kind of had this sort of independent spirit to itself. In terms of firearms rights, Vermont was actually the first state that had permitless carry, or constitutional carry as it's called now. They used to call it Vermont carry. So Vermont has always had this sort of kind of interesting spirit, and that's changed over the years a little bit, but it's definitely a very unique state in terms of American history. And even though it's very similar to neighboring New Hampshire, where I'm from, they're very different at the same time.
Vermont did play its part in the Underground Railroad, as well as Massachusetts did. This whole area up here was part of the Underground Railroad during the Abolition times.
It was settled by Europeans hundreds of years longer than areas out west, so there's just a longer history, and I think Vermont, there's a few stories that might fit into the kind of modern Sasquatch phenomenon, but maybe some are lumped in as sort of wishful thinking as well.
You definitely have some battles in here. You have its grab and pull from different, geographic areas, from the different states to re-grab things through. It's just it's a little different. It's not New York. It's not Massachusetts. It's there. It's its own little place. It's a beautiful, beautiful state.
So Vermont was an independent republic. It was not part of the original colonies. It was on its own for 14 years and then became the first state after the 13 colonies to join the U.S. It's also had a really prominent role in the abolitionist movement and was very important with respect to the Underground Railroad and shuttling slaves from the south to the north. It was also the first state to actually abolish slavery.
Well, in terms of American history, Vermont's a very interesting state. It's a beautiful state. It's the Green Mountain State. It's probably one of the more rural and remote states. To me, it's like one of the most forested, actually, because I've driven in a lot of states, and I'll drive in New Hampshire and you'll see towns. Here you'll see these very small towns. There isn't many fast food joints in Vermont. But in American history, it's very interesting. There was the Battle of Bennington, which was fought in New York. There was only one Revolutionary War battle fought in Vermont, and that was the Battle of Hubbardton. And that was a rear guard action stemming off of Fort Ticonderoga. That's in New York. So that was the only battle, but Vermont did have a very, it wasn't a state at the time, it wasn't a colony. Some of it was part of New York, some of it was part of New Hampshire, some of it was part of Massachusetts. But they had their own identity. They were the Green Mountain State, they were the Green Mountain Boys. That was the name of the troops that came over, that fought the American Revolution. They were the Green Mountain Boys. So it's a very unique state, lovely state, but they're very pro-environment here. So you have some beautiful areas that are left untouched for a lot of time by a lot of people.
There are a number of researchers within the Northwoods investigating Bigfoot within Vermont's borders. Citizen scientists, volunteer organizations, and even academic institutions have conducted research, documented cases, and analyzed evidence in search of the truth about Sasquatch. To the surprise of some, bona fide scientific investigations have taken place, such as the analysis of hair samples and the deployment of motion-activated cameras by University of Vermont researchers and biologists. Media-based investigations have taken place as well, perhaps the most well-known being Animal Planet's show Finding Bigfoot, which visited Rutland, Vermont to investigate a photograph of what some believe to be a Sasquatch carrying a baby.
There's not any highly active groups working in Vermont, and I think that's part of the reason why you don't see a lot of public reports on it. But behind the scenes, I can tell you there are numerous reports from Vermont. They happen almost on a monthly basis, and they've been going back for years and years. I think there's just not that many investigators in Vermont that are actively working in the area. There's certainly some in southern Vermont, but in central and northern Vermont, where I am, I don't know of anybody that's highly active in the area.
Well, Dave and I handle a lot of the cases down here in southern Vermont because there's nobody that covers these. There's several other people, I don't want to really mention their names without their permission, but there are 2 BFRO investigators in northern central Vermont that handle things. And I know Steve Kulls lurks on the BFRO database along with us to investigate them. I don't know of any other source of reports in Vermont other than the BFRO. I don't know if there's another organization I don't know about.
Steve Kulls will try to get over here. Paul Bartholomew will pop over. There are some of the older Nestor guys that don't get in front of the camera that still get into Vermont, New Hampshire, and check those out. If I get any reports this way, I'll generally pass them along to Alex to make sure that, because he's close by. Or I'll pass them to Paul Bartholomew because we're here. And again, the historical stuff on there, I mean, Dr. Cook that was at Castleton College or University back in the 70s, 80s, that was big into the topic. So I don't know if there's still stuff at the university or not, but it might be something to look at, so.
Me. Oh, and by the way, Paul Bartholomew as well, so, the usual cast of characters.
There are reports of sightings throughout the entirety of Vermont, and they've been documented for generations. For example, even as far back as November of 1877, the town of Stannard encountered a 4-foot-tall wild man of the woods, covered in red hair and said to run like a deer while yelling like a hyena. Sightings persist, even into the present day. In winter of 1984, on an isolated road near Colchester, Vermont, a family got uncomfortably close to something outside their understanding. One of the eyewitnesses wrote that the thing was staring at us with 1 foot on a wire fence, holding the wire down with its arm. It was not brown but white, with yellow dirty streaks, and his eyes were reflecting a yellow-amber color like the yellow on caution lights. It was at least 10 feet tall, arms very long, his fur was long. On his face, the only flesh part that didn't have fur was his eyes and upper cheeks. My husband started to slow down to get a better look. That's when I freaked out and started to hit my husband because I was so scared and my girls were screaming. So we kept on going. I just kept thinking about its eyes. Another incredible account dates from 2019. A retired registered nurse and private pilot had a daytime sighting of a dark-colored creature that resembled a chimpanzee at her summer cabin, located in northern Vermont, with the long trail less than a quarter of a mile away. The sighting, which lasted about 12 seconds, from a distance of 125 feet, was one of a handful of experiences that brought the witness and her husband to the conclusion that they were dealing with Bigfoot, which, to their surprise, was supported by neighbors who revealed encounters of their own.
One of the first interviews I ever did regarding Bigfoot was a gentleman named Dax Rushlow, who had an encounter while snowmobiling as a teen up in Newport, Vermont, which is basically on the Canadian border. He was snowmobiling and came across this creature and had sort of this standoff with it. And it was one of the first times I ever really conducted a Bigfoot witness interview over a decade ago, and it really intrigued me the way he described it. Almost, it was super well built and wide, and the look on its face was like it was thinking or reasoning. It really made me wonder, and that's in far northern Vermont. Whereas then you go down to other sections, of course, the Bennington Triangle area that we're located in right now has a long history of sightings. The stagecoach ape man creature attack from the 1800s, that's one of the famous stories in the Bennington Triangle, and there's plenty of ones in the central part of the state. I actually had an interesting encounter happen to me, which I can't say is Bigfoot, but I'll go into the story real quick. In near an area in the Breadloaf Wilderness of, again, where the Appalachian Trail and the Long Trail are going through, near an area called Texas Falls in the National Forest, where while camping one morning, we'd done some wood knocks and put up some pheromone chips the night before, and in the morning we were woken up by wood knocks, and we had basically observed 7 or 8 objects get thrown kind of towards our tent. We didn't have an awning on the tent. We didn't have the rain fly on the tent. So we were witnessing, and we filmed this and have the audio of these weird things hitting the ground in front of the tent. It was unusual. Can I say it was Bigfoot? No. I mean, it kind of fits the behavioral patterns, and it's in an area that has had, that I'm aware of, near Texas Falls and near that part of Vermont, very mountainous, that has had encounters, 10 miles south of there in other areas. So yeah, basically the entire central part of Vermont going up from south to north, there's a history of sightings. Vermont is a very sparsely populated state. I think it's just over 500,000 population-wise, and again, it is the number 4th most forested state in the U.S. So combine low population with a lot of forest and a whole lot of mountain as compared to some of the other New England states. It's no surprise that there is a history of Bigfoot sightings across the state of Vermont. There's not like one particular area that seems to be a hot spot. There's encounters pretty much almost all over the state going decades in the past.
Vermont's got a large history of Bigfoot sightings, just like New York. And in Vermont, there was a major sighting that took place right in the Castleton area, right in West Rutland, Vermont. And it was back in 1985. Now, Dr. Cook, who was a professor of history and anthropology at Castleton, he had gone to China and exchanged information between the Chinese Che Ren and the white, the American Sasquatch. In the time that he went over, he held these 2 conferences at Castleton to show information on these 2 different creatures. And in between those 2 conferences in 1985, there was a sighting in West Rutland, Vermont. And that involved multiple witnesses who saw a creature running up a gravel road, stamping its feet as it ran by, almost shaking the ground. Anybody that's been around cows could feel that same thing. So showing a great weight. And the creature left 6 impressions in this gravel road. Very tough terrain. We figure the weight had to be at least 400 to 500 pounds. And 3 of those were cast by a school teacher there and given to Dr. Cook. So we have, in that particular case, in September of 1985, we have multiple sightings of a creature running up a gravel road, leaving behind footprints that were cast in plaster castings and have been preserved. And that's one of those cases that sticks together and sort of has all the characteristics, including the vocalizations, the high-pitched vocal sounds. So that's one of those cases that you have all three criteria: sighting, footprint find, vocalization.
I attended a BFO expedition in northern Vermont, way up there, Newport, and Christopher Noel, a famous researcher, author, was hosting it. And we were out, there's just one particular night, we were out all night, never heard a sound. He did a couple wood knocks, stuff like that, trying to get a response, and we were on this hill above camp. It was pretty high hill. And it was one of those things where nothing went on the whole night. But we come back about 2 in the morning, called it a night, and I got myself comfortable, laid down. I wasn't laying down 5 minutes, and I heard a vocalization come right from the direction we just came from. Now I come back with everyone, so I knew there was no one still up there, and it was very remote. And it was more, and a lot of people heard it the next morning too. I was so tired from being out that I'm not going out again. I kind of smiled to myself like, you gotta be kidding me. That's where we just came from, but it was nice just to hear it. And most people the next morning, did you hear that last night? Did you hear that? And it was more like a man. We know there was no people up there. And it was more like a hey, like just somebody yelling. And we laughed about it because Chris the next day was like, where we just were, it's really, there's no roads. People don't go up there. It's way off the beaten path, pretty rough road going up. And to us, it was kind of like, hey, come on back. Where's it all going? We joked about that like that's what you get. You're out all night poking around, then as soon as you go back and lay down. I just thought I'd share that one from Vermont.
This bird call that they make, that is based on the oven bird. It incorporates the oven bird in the middle and with a very elaborate intro and outro that you never hear in oven birds. Peak experience with regard to Sasquatch Fieldwork was on September 20th, 2022, when that summer I was spending many nights solo camping near Sasquatch structures where I had also recorded their activity. And I knew that this was part of their territory, not they're there all the time, but that part of their circuit, part of their routine was to be in this part of the woods. I've had Sasquatch interactions 100 yards behind where we're sitting right now. And it's just a micro forest. Any kind of forest where you find a suspicious stick and tree structure that seems not fun for a human to make. You know, like if there's 25 branches with their ends broken off, all stuck in the same crook of a tree, 15 feet off the ground, that's not fun for a human to do. So you find these and you think that could be Sasquatch, then you leave out the audio recorder night after night, and then you listen to it in real time. You can't just look at the spectrograph.
I think one of the most well-known ones happened in September of 2012, where a gentleman that was had an apple orchard noticed that his apples were being missing from the tree. So he set up a trail cam and captured a creature, very interesting looking creature, and BFRO came out and actually looked at it. And although it's not conclusive and it's not unequivocal, and there's different opinions on it, but the creature that was captured in the trail cam is thought by some individuals to be a female Sasquatch carrying her young child.
I mean, there's a couple, but the big one, I've been to the Vermont trail cam footage, Frank Solinsky's place, and sitting and talking to him, looking at that, and right down the street, there was another contractor that had a sighting within a few miles of something, a creature in the water picking things up, out of the water. In Frank's case, that's the trail cam footage of something picking apples up from the front yard. And it's not that easy to get on this property. So it's an interesting location. And again, that's one of the first Bigfoot witnesses that I talked to, like in this area. And right after I got started, I probably have 60 other million questions to ask now of the witness, but it was definitely a very interesting remote location. So his story, a homeowner, hunter, he comes home and his wife notices that the apples are picked off like the top of the tree. And she kind of tells him, hey, you have all these trail cameras. And in his gruff voice, like, I'll take care of it. Goes out, puts a trail camera out, and they've got pictures of a coyote eating and then some sort of creature, in front. Those pictures were originally turned over to Steve Kulls. Steve sends them out to have them looked at by a optical scientist, and they came back. But, being on the property, talking to Frank, he's a very interesting individual, very, nice guy, but you're not going to mess around on his property, just to put it that way. But the actual tree is close to the end of his driveway, but he's got other things that you would book in the area. There's, again, the lake across the street, so there's a lot of other environmental conditions or, food sources that are in the area besides those apples on that tree. And there's not like an orchard of trees. They've got like one or two trees there. And it's been, again, quite a few years since I was, like I said, that was one of the first, like, literally did the A-Bear, like I got the bounce around the whole area that weekend, and it just happened to be, I'm like, oh, here's all the highlights of the northeast of the Vermont, New York area, so.
Yeah, well, there's the Vermont trail cam photo, which it's a highly contested thing. There's people that say, oh, it's an owl, it's a guy in a ghillie suit. Well, we use science to disprove it's something flying in front of the camera, unless it's a bird the size of, a small pterodactyl. We tested a ghillie suit, and you could see the seams in the ghillie suit. It didn't have the same look to it. And why would a guy be running around in a ghillie suit without a gun, number one, and number two, in somebody's front yard when it's not even hunting season? And that area said that. See, Vermont has very easy gun laws. And the property that was on, well, about 6 years earlier, the resident came home to find a burglar in his house. And what did he do? He pulled out his .357 and he held the burglar there until the state police showed up to arrest him. So you don't kind of mess with that kind, and the area was very properly marked. So that's probably the one that really stands out to me. There's another one where the two boys had a sighting where they were throwing rocks into this pit, and all of a sudden a rock came flying out and someone went tooling out of there. That was very interesting. And there's been sightings of, like I said, reports of it by waterways, either drinking or grabbing something, or weed eating, or, trying to drink.
Oh yeah, I could have drove down here. I don't think we're gonna be, but unfortunately, yeah, there's nothing to film.
So that
here.
goes down to the river? Goes
down to the river, and that's where the tracks were. And they kind of like went heading right up the mountain here in that direction. So down in there, where past the no trespassing signs, it says, there was you can show the pictures that I sent you.
Yeah.
There was this trackway that came down through here, across the river. I've never heard of anyone, of course people hoax tracks all the time, but I've never heard of anyone finding tracks that went into the water before and follow them, and by the time we get up here, it was months past.
Check the other side of it.
We spent a couple hours up here walking around, but there was nothing here when we got here. They were all gone. The river goes up and down all the time. But I had pictures of the pictures. So never got to talk to the person who actually took the pictures. there's some great things in those pictures, and then there's some things that don't look right in those pictures. And Cliff and Steve both told me never talk about those things because that would just help people in their perpetuation of hoaxes and stuff like that. So there's like 5 solid things that I've been trained to look for in a potential track. And if something's not there, that's okay. But if they're all not there, or they're all, you know, they help you through your process.